Now it's my pleasure to turn the floor over to Jenny Arena.
Hi, thank you so much. So as Adam says, I'm Jenny Arena, and I'm with Heritage Preservation. We're so glad that you're joining us today. It looks like about 147 people have logged into this meeting room today. We've got a really special webinar in store for you, but let me start by giving just a quick introduction to the community and these webinars. So the Connecting to Collections online community was originally created in cooperation with the American Association for State and Local History, and with funding from the Institute of Museum and Library Services, moderated by Heritage Preservation, and Learning Times produces both the website and the webinars. The goal of the online community has always been to help smaller museums, libraries, archives, and historical societies quickly locate reliable preservation resources, and also to network with their colleagues like you guys are doing today. To help you do that, we've compiled an extensive list of online resources, and they're broken up by topics. Let me grab this. So this is just a screenshot of the website, and you can see our topics menu over here. And we also try to host regularly scheduled drop-in webinars like the one you guys are joining us for today that doesn't require pre-registration on topics that we hope you'll find useful. A recording of today's webinar and of all our webinars can now be found on this toggle right here, Webinar Archives. And we also break them up by topic in the topics menu as well. So we're really excited about today's webinar. It was created in partnership with the American Association for State and Local History Small Museum Committee. And before I introduce our speaker today, I'm going to hand things over to Maggie, who is with the Small Museum Committee, and she's got some great things to share with you guys, some great resources. So Maggie, let me pull this out of the way, and I'll hand things over to you.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Maggie Marconi, and I am the administrator of the Follett House Museum in Sandusky, Ohio, and I am the chair of AASLH's Small Museums Committee. We are thrilled to be partnering with Heritage Preservation here at the Connecting to Collections online community. The American Association for State and Local History and the Small Museums Committee have a lot to offer, and I would like to invite you to check out some of our available resources. Please visit aaslh.org for information on how to become a member of this incredible organization. While you're there, I hope you'll check out the Standards and Excellence Program for History Organizations, which is called STEPS. STEPS has some fantastic information to help museums set up collections policies and procedures. The Small Museums Committee also has a page on the AASLH website. I encourage you to join our listserv and to check out our blog, and all of those are listed there on the screen in front of you. If you would like further information, please be sure to include your contact and email information in the survey that will be administered at the end of today's webinar. I would also like to extend thanks to Joanne Lindstrom, who created the content of this webinar. Thanks, Jenny.
Thank you so much, Maggie. And all these links are also on the online community website associated with this webinar. And so you'll find them when we post the recording of this webinar there as well. So let me go ahead and introduce Bruce, our speaker today. He has kindly agreed to talk to us about collections management policies, and we really couldn't be in better hands. Bruce is a museum administrator and a collections manager with 39 years of experience in the field. He has authored numerous guides as well as books and has served as a consultant in more than 50 museums, historical societies, and professional organizations. He was also an adjunct professor for 20 years at Cooperstown Graduate Program in the Museum Studies Master Program. And he is, Bruce, am I correct in saying you're currently the acting executive director at the Newport Restoration Foundation?
Well, actually, I'm in an interim period. I finished up my 3 months during the summer. Now, unfortunately, our director is headed back into the hospital for a couple of weeks. But I have my hands full, if you put it that way.
But you are Director of Collections for Newport Restoration
that's correct,
Foundation.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Great. Well, Bruce, I'm going to hand things over to you. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this today.
Well, you're quite welcome. I'm very glad to have this opportunity, and I thank Maggie Marconi for organizing it and Joanne Lindstrom for putting the material together and allowing us to use it today. So I'm very pleased that I've had all this great help to get it going. Welcome to everyone to the second webinar in this STEP series. I'm very pleased to be with you today. Actually, this probably isn't the second. I'm sorry, I have an old script. When you're juggling on the high wire, you need to stay on track and be focused on where you're going, right? Well, a collections management policy provides focus for the staff and board with regard to collections. If you don't have a policy, or if you've used one from another institution without giving it much thought, or you have one that you don't use, you're more likely to be distracted by the day-to-day ethical issues that a collections management policy is designed to address. And I just want to let you know, as you're looking at the screen, don't be alarmed. The juggler is not using museum objects, although, of course, some of us have other categories like education materials, properties. And it's good to see that he's wearing typical museum evening wear garb while the juggling is going on. Let's see. The two goals today are to elevate museum collections management policy from a perfunctory document to a practical one, something that's used by your organization to help support and defend difficult decision making. So you're not just out there on your own, but you've got something to back you up. And believe me, I've been in that situation more than once. And second, be ready to create a temporary deposit form and use it within the next 6 months. That's very important also. Things that we'll cover today: policy versus procedure and what's the difference. Collections management policy, again, why have one? Essential elements of a collections management policy and temporary deposit forms. Okay, so now we have a poll to find out about everyone who's watching today. And if you'd like to participate in that, it'll help a little bit to see where folks are from and what kind of an audience we have, and perhaps try to aim things a little bit one way or the other, although the presentation, I think, should be helpful to just about everybody who's interested in this topic. So it seems that we have a lot of people from organizations that are other, so that's good to know. Makes it a little hard to know exactly what I should be trying to tell you, but I think we're on the right track, so don't worry about that. We have some board members, which is always very helpful. Lots of staff members, some volunteers, and quite a few people who have been with your current organization at least for fewer than 5 years. So that is often a kind of situation that lets you know that you need to put together a collections management policy. But I've seen plenty of organizations that have been working on this for a while, and it's still necessary. So you got plenty of company, whatever your situation is. Okay, that's great. All right, well, running a museum is hard work. I think all of us know that. And it helps to have good tools, something I'd like to have. Having the right tool makes things work a lot better. And so it helps to have a good tool, but you need to put it to work once it's all done. Now, policies versus procedures, what's the difference? This is something that's really important because if this isn't made clear as you put a policy together or refine one that you have, you can really get bogged down in information that just doesn't belong in the policy itself. Policies provide the operational framework within which the institution functions, provide formal guidance to coordinate and execute activities. They help focus attention and resources on high priority issues, aligning and merging efforts to achieve the institutional vision. And one thing to keep in mind too, something like a collections management policy is generally something that's adopted by the board, if you have a board. otherwise whatever the governing body may be, so that it really has some authority behind it, and that's very important. There can be administrative policies that are formed, and that's a separate issue. We won't really get into that right now. So let's move on to procedures. Procedures are the operational processes required to implement institutional policy. It can be formal or informal, specific to a department, or applicable across the entire institution. And of course, everything you do can be expressed in terms of procedures. And generally for collections, if you are able to do it, it's very helpful to have a collections procedures manual, which tells you all sorts of things like how to deal with loans from start to finish, how to fill out the worksheets or the forms on computer that you may have for cataloging, and pretty much anything you can think of. And generally, if you look through the manual like that, you come across a lot of things where you realize that somebody must have come across a problem here, because there's a kind of unusual procedure that's described. But there it is. So that anyway, that's the difference, and you don't want everything just mashed all together, or you end up with a very unwieldy document. So the policies tell you what the organization should be doing, and the procedures tell you how to do them. I know that occasionally there are some exceptions to that, and it depends to some extent on how your museum operates. There are certainly a lot of differences between museums, and in all the kinds of surveys that I've done, it's great to see that they're all unique and why they came out to be the way they are. So don't be surprised if your needs aren't the same as everybody else's, but you can certainly use guidelines from all kinds of sources. Okay. So this little graphic on the screen might be helpful just in terms of putting the policy at the center and the procedures around. And I've already mentioned a few of these, but procedures for cataloging, process for inventory, which we'll mention a little bit later, keeping track of objects, going on and off exhibit, steps to fill out loan forms, and so forth. So generally, the procedures tend to be many in number. And another important thing is that they can be changed by staff decisions. Policy is changed by and adopted by the board. So you don't want to be coming back every few months saying, well, we need to change the policy. The board will wonder if you know what you're doing. So get a jump on that to begin with, and it should be good for a number of years. The first element of just about anything involving a policy, and sometimes even procedures, is a statement of purpose. And to that, you'd add a description of collections, not just a mission statement, but also information about the collection and the goals for the museum pertaining to the collections. There's an example here. The Henry Clay Memorial Foundation will present a permanent historical collection to accomplish its goal of presenting a historically accurate view of life at Ashland. The collection may be seen as having two parts, historical and interpretive. The historical collection will consist of objects and documents owned and used by Henry Clay and the Clay family descendants who lived at Ashland. The interpretive collection will consist of objects not belonging to the Clay family, but having historical significance, interpreting the life of Henry Clay, the Clay descendants, and life at Ashland in the 19th and early 20th centuries. That's a really good statement of purpose. And it pertains to a historical house, which is a kind of institution where this really lends itself to pretty precise definitions. If you work in a historical society or other kinds of more general museums, you may need to be a little more creative and inclusive of many kinds of objects, but just see how that goes for you. And note that this comes from Marie Malero's book on legal issues in museums, which is a very important tome to keep on hand. Probably mention it again. Okay, other things to include in the policy: acquisition of objects. What will you accept and not accept? Do you accept buildings, land? And something to keep in mind here, maybe your institution would want to consider buildings as collection items. To many museums, that would be pretty radical, and I'm not going to go into any arguments for or against that, but it's just a point to consider. Also, the forms used to process incoming collections, you don't have to put the forms in the policy. Again, if you need to change one little thing, you have to get the board to adopt it. So keep it simple. Deaccessioning, always a frightening topic, to say the least. Once something goes out the door, it's gone forever, and you've got to be awfully sure that you're not going to be viewed as the person who really made a big mistake in the museum. So again, what procedures do you follow? Who is authorized to deaccession? And generally, this chain of command there, that's quite important. Where do objects go when deaccession? There can be a lot of choices there. Sometimes museums just stick to one method, and that's it, and that's fine if that suits your purposes. What are the criteria for deaccessioning? So that's another important point as well, something you really have to stick to. The essential elements of a collections management policy: incoming and outgoing loans, or I tend to prefer sometimes to put it lending and borrowing. It's really the same thing. It just depends on what sort of picky language you like to use. To whom do you loan? Will you just lend things to anybody? Do you just lend to accredited museums? And for what purposes would the loans be? Do you lend to community organizations? And do you accept permanent loans? I would say right off the bat for that one, don't do it. If you can keep from accepting sort of nebulous long-term loans, so much the better. Objects that are placed in the custody of the museum, you need a temporary deposit form, and we'll get to this more in a few minutes. I've already mentioned it a couple of times. And how do you cope with abandoned property? I think all of us have run into this, and it can be a real headache, because not only do you not know who has the title and ownership of the object that's left in your hands or on your doorstep, sometimes literally, but you really may not know anything about the object itself, and what's the purpose of having it? There's no story. That's something that I comment on with our board all the time. We're always looking for connections and stories. That's what makes it all worthwhile. All right, for records, how do you maintain records for the collection? At least roughly where the responsibilities lie for that should be mentioned in the policy. Maintaining records is a large part of the museum's responsibility, and the trustees have been sued, and most people who are on boards have heard about some of these stories, and believe me, most of them are true and certainly frightening. So you really have to be sure that the records are complete. And in small museums, I know this can be a huge problem, because often in the past the records haven't been kept all that well, and sometimes there are even multiple cataloging and record systems. And all I can say is, you've got a lot of company, but it's something that you just have to figure out how it's going to be dealt with, and getting it down on paper will help to ensure that this is not going to keep happening. So that's pretty important as well. Okay. Insurance. Explain what type of policy you have for the collection in the policy. So this is made clear. Is the collection insured at full value and so forth? What things are covered, what isn't covered, how are borrowed items treated. You don't want that to come as a big surprise when you have items coming in for an exhibit, perhaps, and then you suddenly discover that you have to spend a lot of money for an insurance rider in order to get things covered. But again, it's something that you have to sort out ahead of time. There are museums that do not have insurance at all on their collections. That's pretty risky. If you're self-insured, then it means that you at least have a fund of some kind to help cover losses should they occur. But it's a question with a lot of possibilities behind it, and so it's just one more of those fun things to figure out while you're composing your policy. And as always, talk to colleagues, talk to people who have been through this before, look at examples, and see what's going to work if you don't have all of these answers at the beginning. Okay, inventories. Here include how you inventory your collection, and whether it's annually, every 3 years, every 5 years, on a rolling basis, and so forth. And this is, again, something that is an essential thing to do. So the answer to this really belongs in your policy. It helps show that you are taking care of your collections in the public interest, and a part of that is to know where everything is. And there's nothing that gives chills down my spine more when I'm doing a survey or another sort of consultation for a museum and find out that collections are just sort of placed here and there, and there's no indication as to where anything is. That's just a frightening situation. So anyway, here's a little story that actually is linked to a CAP survey that I did for a small historical society, and they knew that they had to complete an inventory because one had never been done before. This was in 1999 for an organization that was founded in 1914. It was a long time for things to get lost, or at least mixed up pretty well. They felt overwhelmed at the prospect, and they have a small staff and a small budget. So they decided that they'd do a rolling inventory, which is one that you are constantly doing section by section, and in this case it worked beautifully. At the time, the curator was able to spend every Monday working on inventory, since the museum is closed on Mondays. They worked with a textile expert, a bottle expert, a hat expert, expert in local Native American objects, and you name it. Each of them came in at no charge because they had an opportunity to look at this wonderful museum collection behind the scenes, and basically, in many cases, things that nobody had seen in decades. For that museum, they were able to get solid dates for the objects and other information on the collection, all while doing an inventory. Now, it could be that adding even those little bits of information to the inventory, which is basically what is the object, what's the accession number, and what's the location. If that slows things down too much, just streamline the inventory and stick to the very basics, and it should go faster. But if it works to get a little more information at the time, that's great. I've used the same method as that museum did with good success, and in many cases we were able to invite experts in to see wonderful assortments of objects that they never would have seen otherwise, and they were willing to do it free of charge, but not everybody who we contacted could afford to do that. Some of them were museum staff people, and although, of course, we're all immensely wealthy and so forth, they needed a little compensation for helping us out, and that's only fair. But overall, we got a lot of expert help without cost, and that was terrific. So back to the Small Historical Society, and while the inventory was going on, they also did rehousing of objects while they were at it, replacing all of the old tissue paper with new acid-free stuff. Again, that may drag things out a little bit longer than you can afford to deal with, but just see how it goes. The more you can do while you're moving the objects around is certainly better, but it's hard to say that something that works for one museum is going to work for everybody. I pretty much know that isn't the case. So, and don't forget, you will definitely want to include in the inventory section of the policy information for how you will document missing objects if and when something comes up missing. And if you don't note anything that's missing, tell everybody you know, because I've never heard of such a thing in a museum. But there may be one out there someplace. So wouldn't that be great? There are a number of things, such as access to the collections, that are important to state in the policy, but they do not have to be explained at great length. You just have to indicate that you provide access, that if there are different purposes for it, that's fine. If it's public access, scholars, or whatever. So who has access to the collections and under what circumstances? Are there, again, different categories? Generally there are. I mean, you can't really afford the time to just let everybody come in and poke around in storage, I don't think. Is there a time limit or days of the week? That may be getting a little specific, honestly, to put in a policy, but that's okay. And as in most of these areas and parts of the policy, it doesn't hurt if you are fairly strict about what you will allow and what you will require and what you will do in the first place. It's a lot easier to allow yourself to be more flexible and beneficent if there are requests that seem to be too limited by what you require. But if you're too liberal in the first place, it can be a tremendous headache, because then it's just too hard to say no, and people think that you're being just too arbitrary about making decisions, and it's a great way to make lots of enemies. So be as strict as you can first, and if you need to make exceptions as things go along, that's okay. An important item in terms of access is who must be present for people having access. This is a real time consumer for staff folks to work with, even scholars, but anybody who's coming in to see collections. You can't just let people come in unsupervised, as far as I know. And who do you have who can manage that sort of situation? Are photographs permitted when people are coming in to look at collections? So these are, again, all important items, and should be stated in terms of what you can permit. All right, now final thoughts include the governing body's date of approval of the policy. That's very important, because otherwise, no matter how you file them in your Wii computer files or wherever they may reside, it's awfully easy to lose track of different versions. And even at the beginning, there may be a draft and then a version that's approved, and then a few years later, something else has to be added. And if that's not stated on the form itself, in the text at the end usually, then that can be a real nightmare, and it doesn't make anybody look good to have to contend with things like that and try to explain it. So just keep track of that. It's certainly easy enough to do it. If you'd like to have a version number and a date along with that, and usually as you go along over the years, there'll be a string of version numbers and dates, and it's helpful to keep those all on there, so you'll know where the different versions were made and where you are for the present at the version people are looking at. So all of these helpful items. So now another poll, if we may. Does your museum have an approved collections management policy in place? And there's some other questions.
Sorry, Bruce, it looks like this might be wrong. This is the wrong question. So answer
right.
this question as suppose it, does your institution have a collections management policy in place? So yes, no,
okay.
or you don't know. Sorry about that, guys.
All right, well, that's okay. So now we're seeing museums that have the policies and what our participants think of them, so that's very helpful as well. Let's see. Okay, so not surprisingly, I suppose, for folks who are participating in this webinar today, a lot of people feel that the policy is not really living up to the need that the museum has. That it may need revisions, that it just isn't something that's all that helpful. But it's nice to see that there's a couple of dozen there at least with policies that are well written and adequate to protecting the museum collection, because that's what we're after. So good to know where that we're serving our audience in the right way. Okay, now a couple of questions or cases for you to think about. Let's see, where are we here? All right, a college art museum in Virginia. The college forcibly removed, it sounds pretty violent, but may be a little more exciting sounding than it was, but you know what we mean here. It removed 4 valuable paintings from its collection to finance general operating expenses of the college, and I think forcibly just means without regard to what the museum staff had to say about it. There have certainly been a few instances of that or threats of it in recent years. How could a collections management policy have helped in that circumstance? Okay, I'm not necessarily going to provide you with the miracle answers to this, because that's not always the case. But as you, I think, will understand that if you have a policy in place, at least it can be demonstrated that the museum is taking proper responsibility for these collections, that they're important to be held in the public trust and so forth, and that any other use of them will be improper at best. That doesn't necessarily mean that you can work miracles if those in power above you have other ideas. Okay, another case, a museum in Washington, D.C. museum trustees borrow objects for their own uses? How could a collections management policy have helped there? I think that is a little more straightforward in that the trustees should be the ones who understand the responsibilities of the museums, who understand holding the collections in the public trust, and that at least possibly when they're faced with their own collections management policy, if they have one, they would understand that indiscriminately lending objects to individuals is just highly improper, even if they're board members. That can be a tough one to deal with if you don't have backup in working against something like that. But if that policy is there, you have the instrument in writing that should help make that point. That's very, very important. Okay, case 3. Let's see, the evil overlords at Christie's. Actually, very good folks there, and we don't mean to paint them in a bad way at all. For one thing, they're extremely knowledgeable folks in terms of art and artifacts of many kinds. But in this case, a museum deaccessioned 3 paintings, to which it did not have clear title. How could a collections management policy have helped? And in that case, I think it's pretty clear that the policy would outline what is necessary in order to consider deaccession of anything from the collection. And obviously one of those criteria would be a clear title, and that should be noticed right away. But another thing that's somewhat comparable to this, not quite as serious because the object would still be there, but I'm familiar with at least one museum that carried out some extraordinarily long and expensive conservation projects on at least one object in the collection that was not the property of the museum. It turned out that the lender didn't really care and was, of course, rather pleased that they got all that work for free. But it was a colossal waste of money by the museum in an instance like that. So just awfully good to have that all in writing and make sure everybody in authority is familiar with it. Okay, now, do you have temporary deposit forms? And let's see what people have. Okay, a lot of people have that. Some people don't know, and I hope that in that case, you haven't been put in a position where you need one, just didn't have it, but have the luxury of not being put in that position at all, which is really a comfortable place to be, and that's great. If you don't have a temporary deposit form, it's helpful to have one. I know that some museums use a loan form for that, but really those are 2 different categories, because usually a loan form is used for something. Excuse me. A loan form is used for documenting an object that you know you would like to have in the museum for a while, usually for a specific purpose. Temporary deposit is for something that just either comes in over the transom, figuratively speaking. But the narration for this picture is, what if the folks at the table just wandered away and walked out the front door? What would you do with the stuff that they left behind? So there's a nice variety of materials there. And you can't necessarily judge right off the cuff whether you're going to accept it for the museum, use it for exhibition, hold on to it to study for the meanwhile, or what. Don't be caught in that kind of a situation, and include that in a policy, and then of course come up with a form that you'll have on hand for situations like this. The three reasons that you need a temporary deposit form: first, for your own legal protection. Once you begin using the forms regularly, you'll be protecting your history organization from having more abandoned objects in the collection. Both parties sign and date the document and will provide some protection if the potential donor doesn't come back for his or her item many years down the road. Did you know that this is some kind of old information. There are a number of states in the country that do not have abandoned property legislation. Rhode Island is on the list in this script, but luckily for us in Rhode Island, a few months ago, the legislature did pass abandoned property legislation pertaining to museums, so we're really happy about that. If your state does not have such a thing, it's certainly worth pursuing it with the state legislators, and eventually your fellow museum workers in your state will thank you profusely. Okay, the second reason, formal documentation. What collections manager or registrar doesn't love formal documentation? When you use this form, it will travel with the object, and if the object is accepted into the collection, it will remain in the object file. If the donor doesn't come back, but you decide to add the item to your collection, you have the documentation already in place. It doesn't solve all your problems, but it goes a long way. 3, it demonstrates the museum's commitment to professionalism. If I were going to donate to a museum, I would be impressed to know that the organization has its bases covered. I would know that you were taking your public trust responsibilities seriously and that yours is a professional organization. And actually, one thing that you may do with different forms is put part of the pertinent part of the collections management policy printed on the back of the form, so that if people have questions about that, say, well, why do you do that? What's the background? It will be right there. You don't have to throw it in people's faces usually, but it's helpful to demonstrate that you're not just pulling the stuff out of the air, and at the same time, you don't have to give them the entire policy to read and pick out the interesting parts. So, the essential elements of a temporary deposit form. This is something created by John Simmons. And he has written things all over the place. His own individual publications, but also some one or more articles in the Registrar's Handbook published by AAM, now in its 5th edition, I believe. So that's a helpful thing to have as well. But he expresses these things very well, and recommend anything that he's written generally. He has many other tables that he's composed, including one on a grading strategy for collections, or one of everyone's favorites, one on the guidelines for developing an intellectual property rights policy that reads like a very handy flow chart. And some of these things, like that one in particular, the intellectual property rights, can be a real headache unless you have something that's as well organized as this kind of chart to look at. So anyway, go over these rows in the chart, and of course, you don't have to memorize them all right now. They'll be available later at your convenience, which is great. Okay, we're winding down a bit on time, so I want to give you a few things to take away today. A short step-by-step process that you can follow to get a useful collections management policy in place at your history organization. Gather your information. Collect all the information that you have about your collection. How many objects? How many are cataloged? Do you have a teaching collection? Or again, some other sort of category, education objects, or whatever they may be called, use objects, properties. There are all kinds of different names according to what you might want to do with them. Is the collection well cared for? Do you have a separate line item in your budget for collections care, etc.? And this may be a time actually to establish some of those kinds of things like collections care. If you don't have a line item in the budget, it can be awfully tough to get that established if there's never been one before. You know, the old saying, well, you know, we always did it that way, or we never did it that way. But even a little bit will help, and it just helps to demonstrate that that's something that's important. Are you going to put all of these things into your collections management policy? No. You want to get your committee members up to speed. You don't want to flood the policy with everything. They may not know that you have 10,000 objects, but only clear title to 45% of them. So let your committee that's working with you know where you stand. Collecting this information will drive home the point that you need to get working on a temporary deposit form as well. Your committee members may not understand that many history organizations have one permanent collection and another teaching collection. They may not understand the value of having collections care as a separate line item in the budget. This is a great opportunity to get a clear picture of your organization. Okay, so we mentioned a task force or committee. Now, in order to put one together, if you're an all volunteer organization, you would probably assign your collections volunteers, or one or two people, whatever you have, the board president, and a couple of other board members. If your board is unable to commit the time, see if you can recruit a member of your organization to help you out, or even an enthusiastic high school or college student. I'm sure we all have interesting stories to tell about how students have done various things for us, maybe not so successfully, but certainly in the museums I've worked for, we've had some really excellent help from some young folks. So that's at least a possibility and worth pursuing. They might bring a valuable perspective to the table, and that's certainly true these days. So collection staff, chief administrator, or executive director, et cetera, depending on your structure, a couple of board members, if at all possible, and in the end, or in an advisory capacity along the way, an attorney to make sure that what you're doing is legally binding, legally acceptable in the way it is written and put together. So, breaking out the work, determine what skills your committee members have. It's a good idea to do this ahead of time so you don't have everybody trying to do the same thing. But anyway, when those of you who work with volunteers probably know how to deal with that kind of organization better than I do, and this is pretty important. And some of the skills involved in this are writing, research, and ethics and law to get it all organized. As much as possible, ask committee members to take a task that will fit into their schedules and match their strengths and interests. You don't want to mask their strengths and interests. Okay, step 4. Sort things out on a calendar and think about using technology to ease the process of meeting and revising multiple versions of your documents. Another possibility is to make a Gantt chart This is actually the name of Henry Gantt, who invented a chart for organizing various kinds of activities. And if you like to do things that way, that may well prove very helpful. Definitely you don't want to just enter into this with a nebulous schedule, which pretty well guarantees that you won't know when you can expect to be done. So at least try to organize it so you have an end in sight. Some of the other tools that you might want to use, and it just depends entirely on you and your group, whether this will be helpful or people will turn and run at the sight of something like this. And Google Documents is one. It's actually pretty easy to use, but again, if people aren't used to it, you might want to try it out and just see whether it's going to work in your instance or not. Google Sites is another possibility. Generally, these things are actually pretty easy to use, but if you have to work too much against the grain, then it's okay. There are lots of other ways. You can email things back and forth, even put them on paper, heaven forbid. So do what works for you, but there are a lot of possibilities. The sample Gantt chart gives you some idea of how that works, and it's primarily for scheduling, but it lets people know that you've got this all thought out and have the end in mind, and it may help actually get there in the time that you want. So finally, put your policy to work. Discuss with your board or executive director about the need to create or revise your collections management policy. If everyone agrees to move ahead, establish a committee and break the tasks out to subcommittees. My own feeling is you don't want to go too far in involving hordes of people in this, or it may well be something that you really would work better with fewer people. But you don't necessarily want to be a lone ranger either. Take time to create a temporary deposit form. One of the most important items to ensure that you don't have a lot of orphan artifacts in your organization. So we've pretty well wrapped it up here. We can take some questions and spend a little bit more time. I know this is scheduled for an hour, and we're practically there. I'd be happy to accept emails if you have questions that way, and I'll look at the I'll look at this website and try to catch questions there as well, because I think there are a lot of specific things and possibly some fairly general ones that will go way beyond what we've covered today. And occasionally when I've taught this before, it's taken a lot more time. I realize there are kind of restrictions on how much we can do at once here, but let's see what we can do.
Yeah, Bruce. We do have a couple of questions, and I'll try to get to them. Our producer is kind enough to stay on for 15 minutes after the fact. So I know all of you may not be able to do that, but we will try to get to your questions. There are a couple, but before we do that, let me go ahead and post our link to the evaluation. It would be great to hear what you guys thought of the webinar, and also really important, we'd love to hear what ideas you have for future webinars. And this one is particularly special because if you're interested in learning more about the small museum community, there's a spot on there to put your email, so you can sign up for more information on that and more information on their listserv. So click on that if you are interested in learning more. So Bruce, let me just jump right into the questions.
Sure.
We had a couple questions about that temporary deposit form. Could you explain that one more time?
Sure. When objects come into the museum for inspection, people, in my experience anyway, often have items that they might want to give to the museum. And the general scenario that I have in mind is that a person will bring in something, often from a an elderly relative or friend or whatnot, would the museum be interested in these items? And it's awfully difficult under any circumstances I can think of to make a snap decision on that. It's helpful for you in the museum to take the time to look the objects over. Are they really what the potential donor thinks they are? If they're not, that's a separate problem, which can be kind of entertaining in a grim sort of way. But in order to give yourself the time to look things over and keep a record of exactly what it is that you have and who it's from, you need the temporary deposit form. And as I said, some people use a loan form for that. I think it's helpful to have a separate temporary deposit form because the purpose is entirely different. You're not necessarily saying that the museum endorses anything about this object. Sometimes people will decide, well, the museum can tell me all about this, and I'm just going to take it back. And once I find out it's worth a small fortune. So there are a lot of different possibilities that you may end up with. But if you have that document, then you'll know where the object belongs if you decide not to keep it, or if you need further information if you do decide to keep it. So it's really important. I've been in a situation before where we had dozens of objects with no documentation, and it was just an incredible, and this is over, I think, 20 years that I was there, an incredible waste of time to keep checking these things in inventory, trying to find out something about them, and making an effort to decide what could we do to get them out of the collection. So that's why that is particularly important, and I think there's you can find good examples of that, and by all means consider how serious it is to have that on hand for your own sanity and for the sake of your museum.
Great. And a couple of questions. Some folks were saying that they had temporary custody forms. Is that the same as a temporary deposit form?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay.
Yes. Right.
Okay. And we also had a lot of folks who were interested in seeing a template for a temporary deposit or custody form. And we have Leah, who says that a lot of those can be found on the AAM's registrar's listserv. Do you know of another spot where folks could find a template for that?
Let me see. I know of some possibilities, and without leafing through the books right now, I'm not absolutely sure. But the AAM registration methods publication is a very good one for that kind of information. Sometimes I know in our regional museum conference, in our case, New England Museum Association, the staff there keep examples of various kinds of documents on hand, and so maybe your regional organization would have those. And but I think that either the registration listserv, registrar's listserv, or that publication are pretty good places to start.
Great. And if we find something here, we'll make sure to post that to the website for this webinar, so
Great.
You guys will see it there.
Great.
Let's see. We have another question from Ruth, and I think this is an issue lots of museums run into. She says, is a loan made to the museum 60 years ago still a loan if there are no heirs apparent? If there's no one attached to the object anymore, is it still a loan?
Oh, yes. And that's why you fervently pray that the state, wherever your museum is, has legislation pertaining to abandoned property in museums, because then there is a legal process in place specifically for dealing with museum collections, and it doesn't necessarily make it a walk in the park to deal with that situation, but at least you know if you have and I'm not just pulling something out of the dark here. This is a real example. A beautiful little horse-drawn wagon that was loaned to a museum in the 1940s, and in the 1990s, the museum wanted to get it out of the collection because it was still a loan. Fortunately, with a state abandoned property law in effect, the museum just had to follow what the procedures were, and basically it meant publishing information about the loan in the newspaper. And this is something that doesn't happen quickly, but at least it's something that, a procedure you can follow and end up with a result. And more than likely, you're not going to end up in court over it either, which is another possibility if you don't have legislation. So that's the way to deal with that. Unfortunately, old loans are difficult to convert into permanent collection items for the museum if there is no state legislation.
And we do have one follow-up question that kind of ties this last question in our temporary deposit form questions. Katie in Colorado is curious, can the temporary deposit form act as a deed of gift form? It's a permanent gift. If the donor can't be located or reached, the museum wants the item. Can that temporary deposit form be used as a deed of gift?
Well, if that's one of the stipulations on the form, and a lot of them that I've seen have a stipulation that if the objects listed are essentially abandoned in the museum and the depositor cannot be located, that within a certain time period, 3 months or whatever, the items will become the property of the museum to do with as the museum sees fit. I have never been in a situation to actually enforce something like that myself, so I don't know what the legal implications would be. But certainly, if you're putting together the form and you would like to include that language as one of the terms and conditions on the form, you need to have an attorney look at the entire thing anyway, and if that gets approval from your legal advisor, then that's good, and you can go ahead and use that. You always have to keep in mind the possibility that somebody's going to end up making the museum look like a bad guy, and I've been in that position before, and it's just a miserable thing to deal with. But generally, it doesn't happen. I don't mean to be trying to scare anybody, but you should keep it in mind. But on the other hand, you don't want a bunch of artifacts that are in legal limbo. So if you get that on your form, that abandoned things will be converted to gifts and become the museum's property, and it's legally acceptable, then that's great.
Okay, and we did have a mention earlier about that temporary deposit form, a template. If you're using Past Perfect, there is a template, it sounds like, in that program,
Great.
a temporary custody form. Another kind of legal question from Sandy that we got earlier was, so is a collection management policy, is it considered a legal document?
Yes, and that's why it is essential once everything is put together that you have an attorney look it over. You may need to find somebody who has not really a specialty, but at least a little experience with nonprofits and so forth to look it over, because it is something that's adopted by the board that governs how the organization is going to act in various circumstances. You don't want to do something that will be contravening your bylaws or local or state laws, and so with that all taken care of, and with the adoption by the board, it's a legal document, and that really acts as protection for you. And it's a reason not to load the document down with lots of minor procedures and things like that you might change on a basis that that doesn't require such serious consideration. But yeah, it's a legal document for sure.
Okay, and we have about 10 more minutes, and I do have to warn everyone, we have a few more questions. At 3:15, we may all be kicked out of the room because the webinar officially ends, but I'm going to keep posing these questions. And let me also just note our next webinar, so an hour-long webinar, you don't need to register, you can just show up, is actually Tuesday, November 19th at 1 p.m. We're following our online course about outreach, and we are just doing one webinar on using social media because it's so important. And so if you can't do the full-blown course, we understand. We do have a webinar available November 19th. So Bruce, we did get a question from Dee, and this is a great question. She says, how does the conservation policy or conservation policy, how does it relate to the collections management policy? Is it a part of the same document? Are they different? How does the collections management policy live with the other policies of an organization?
Right. Okay. Well, going back to the beginning to some extent, there are numerous possibilities here, and I'm not trying to avoid the question. But as I mentioned, some of the items of the collections management policy mention such items as access to the collections, care of collections, and so forth. And in many policies that I've seen, those kinds of subjects are not extensively explored, but they're just expressed in terms of who has responsibility for caring for the collections, and the policy may say that the museum, the organization, does have a line item in the budget for conservation and recognizes the ethics of the American Institute for Conservation, and a few things like that. A few sentences is fine if that's what is really pertinent to you and you don't have an operation that's particularly complicated. And if you deal solely with contract conservators, and obviously you don't really need to go too far in expressing how the work will be done, because that's more up to them. But as long as the basic rules are covered, that's what you're after.
Okay.
Yes.
So we had a few questions when we were talking about doing an inventory, and Marcia was curious. Can a photograph of the entire collection be used to expedite the inventory process?
Okay. Well, I suppose so. I mean, having any kind of an image or individual images is certainly a big help. And I know of some organizations that have used videotape, just to walk through the museum or even their storage, because just about everything was visible, and a little narration. It's not perfect, but it's better than nothing. So I would say that if you can get an image of the entire collection, it certainly helps until you can get individual images of the objects at some later time.
And then in that inventory, Leanne was curious how much information should be included. I think Leah responded and said item number and location. Should anything else be included in that inventory?
Right. Item number, an identification of what the object is, and the location. Sometimes, depending on what your collections are like, you may want to throw in a couple of words about the object, just so that it's more than a chair or a varnished chair, because in our collection, in one of our museums, all of the chairs are varnished. So, a few extra words saying exactly what style it is, that would be a big help. But that's really about all you need, and it's just to establish where everything is.
Okay. And then just a couple of questions about what to include in the policy. Dee is curious if you would include something in your policy about the time frame for processing new sessions.
That might not be a bad idea. Actually, doing the work is a procedure and a process, as we mentioned earlier. But having a time frame is pretty important, because actually for any of these things, whether it's for lending and borrowing or for getting processing done for accessions and deaccessions, because it helps ensure that the work will be organized and it will be done in a timely manner, not just dropped somewhere, so that you in other words, you want to eliminate the possibility that something is halfway deaccessioned and all of a sudden you've got no records for it anymore, or whatever the instance might be. So that's actually a very good point, and it's good to do that. Just be sure that if you are making a time limit for that it's a reasonable one, so the staff can actually get the work done.
And then also in that policy, Jennifer was curious, would you include information that stipulates how funds from deaccessioning can be used?
Oh my, yes. I almost lost my job in an interesting situation once, which involved a board member who wanted to deaccession more things than were actually approved at one point, and he had lots of ideas for how the funds could be used, none of which aligned with code of ethics from ASLH or AAM or our own institution, as it happened. So it's important to state those kinds of things in the policy. And certainly, deaccessioning is a very touchy subject, and use of the funds. I usually don't lay down absolutes about anything, but this is one case where for almost every museum that I know of in their policy, funds from deaccessions can be used only for acquisition of new collections objects, and sometimes, depending on the institution, they will also allow the funds to be used for direct conservation treatment for collections. And that's it.
Okay, so we're running out of time, so I'm just going to ask one more question of you,
Okay.
Bruce.
Sure.
Peter had a follow-up question about the inventory list. He's curious, would it also be a good idea to include some information about the condition of the object as well?
You can do that, and I guess perhaps what Peter has in mind is objects that are maybe not in the best condition. You can add information that's important to your situation, and the reason I suggested an inventory using a minimum number of information fields is to enable you to get through it in the least amount of time. It may be, as with the example of the small historical society, to do some rehousing of objects, if you can fit that in, to have the experts help identify a little bit more about the objects as you're looking at them. So those kinds of things are certainly fine if it works out in your situation and you don't end up with a project with no end in sight. So, by all means, tailor it to what works for you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Bruce, and thank you to Maggie. We're out of time today. A recording of this webinar will be in the online community as soon as it's available to us. And of course, feel free to continue the conversation on our discussion board on the online community, a great place to get answers. Bruce, you've even weighed in. But thank you, Bruce, and thank you to all of our folks who signed in today.
Very good. Well, again, thanks to everybody who made this possible, and it was a pleasure to take part in it, and I will do my best to answer questions that come up afterwards, either by email or on the website.